Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out for the early bird special. We have what I think is a really fantastic panel today. So let's get things started. You'll notice on the title screen, I have gone ahead and put up a hashtag for the panel. In addition to using hashtag BHUSA, if you have questions or things you want to comment on, if you could use that hashtag, it'll use fewer of your 140 characters than if you try tweeting at all four of us today. So really, I'm thinking about you here. So getting things started, a little bit about me. I am currently the open source software security program strategy lead, I don't know, throw a bunch of words in there, at Microsoft. And I actually don't do anything with the Microsoft Bounty program, so please, no questions, because I can't answer them. So you're wondering, why am I moderating a panel on bug bounties? Well, I spent about 3 years as the Senior Director of Research Operations as a bug bounty platform provider. And before that, I spent over 4 years in a PSERT, the Product Security Incident Response team at BlackBerry, receiving vulnerability reports from researchers. So I've been on both the offense and the defensive side of receiving vulnerability reports, both in and out of bug bounty programs. And I'm a Black Hat Content Review Board member. So this year we had a number of excellent talks submitted on what people who run bug bounties have learned through that process. And we couldn't accept all of them, and it was really hard to pick because they were all fantastic. So we thought, hey, let's put together a panel and invite some of those submitted speakers. So let's talk about our panelists today. We're going to start with Angelo Prado. He is Director of Product Security at Salesforce. And he is also an independent security researcher. He has worked in software and application security at Salesforce, at Microsoft, at Motorola. We didn't actually know each other at Microsoft, but we met this week. And he is also a contributor to Breach. And I wrote down what the Breach acronym stands for, so I get it right. Browser reconnaissance and exfiltration via adaptive compression of hypertext. So he's on both ends of the security research experience as well, both defending and attacking. Our second panelist I want to introduce today is Charles Valentine. He is Vice President of Technology Services at Indeed.com. He wins the award for person who looks least like his LinkedIn profile photo. And as a Vice President of Technology Services, his work spans across infrastructure operations, engineering, security, business intelligence, IT application development, and IT help desk. So he's got his finger in a lot of different pieces of the business. And our third panelist today is Lori Rangel. She is the Director of Product at Silent Circle, with 18 years of IT experience spanning from software to hardware, support, operational data security, and in the last 5 years at Silent Circle, she's been working in mobile peer-to-peer encrypted communications. I'd like to let each of them take about a minute to talk about what their bug bounty and what their product focus is, so that as we go through these questions, you have an idea, because we have everything from welterweight to middleweight to flyweight sized companies here today. And so regardless of where you're coming from, there should be some experiences that you can pick up and benefit from. So let's start with Angelo.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm Angelo. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I know it's hard. It was hard for us to get up here, so I can't imagine. So at Salesforce, I've been running the bug bounty program for about 3 years. We are one of the largest private programs in the industry. We're currently running in HackerOne with about 1,000 researchers invited to the program. And we look forward to a great conversation because we're getting lots of value from the program. We think there's a lot of great lessons that we want to share with you today and have a productive conversation.
Can you talk a little bit about the technology that's in scope for your bounty?
Yeah, so typically when you're looking at setting up a program, you want to make sure that you have a self-service trial sign up. So most programs out there, including ours, there's demo accounts that you can sign up for in separate infrastructure, and that typically covers the entire core public-facing product. So that's typically what most companies do, including us as well.
Okay. And I'm going to hop over to Charles and go in the order of the slide. Charles, can you tell us a little bit about the scope of the Indeed bounty program and what Indeed does?
Okay. Indeed is a job search platform. If you're looking for a job, you might know who we are. So basically the goal is to get all the jobs online, and so we assist in the apply process, and there's also an employer product, so lots of PII and things like that running through the system. We launched a bug bounty program in 2014, so about 3 years ago, and the scope is pretty wide. Basically, our internal rule is if we make a change that due to something that a researcher told us about, we pay out on that. And so there's, I think the whole industry with bug bounties is kind of maturing in this way, trying to figure out what do you pay on and so on. We've had a good experience with it.
And then Lori, can you talk a little bit about the Silent Circle bounty program?
So Silent Circle are the makers of BlackPhone 2, that's our hardware platform, and Silent Phone for voice, video, and file transfer and messaging, peer-to-peer encrypted communications. So our bounty program spans the gamut of that scope. So we primarily focus on the Silent Phone application as one of our higher value targets. We also have, through trial and error, done private bounty programs. We've done public bounty programs on multiple vendor platforms.
All right. So let's start off with some of the numbers and some of the results from their program. As you can see, Salesforce started in early 2015, Indeed a little before that in late 2014, Silent Circle also in late 2014. And so I'm not going to read through the numbers, y'all can read, but Angelo, I'd like to start with you. Looking at the volume and the amount paid out, is it worth it? Is the bug bounty worth it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Without going into any specifics, you're typically looking at a 10x ROI in terms of payout per vulnerability, right, per valid bug that you accept, compared to other means like professional services. One of the interesting things about the bug bounty concept that it may not be obvious to everyone, but you pay for performance. So if there are duplicates or issues that you're not willing to fix, or you want to accept the risk, or they're just invalid, you're not going to be paying for those. So that's, yeah, I absolutely think it is worthwhile.
Okay. Well, Charles, that brings up a good point about invalids. So for the purposes of this slide, if something was deemed valid but low risk and not eligible for reward, maybe a P5, that's not invalid. That's valid but not rewarded. So Charles, with a almost 40% duplicate rate and a near 50% invalid rate, is a bug bounty worth it for Indeed?
We think it is. We actually pay, so we use an external vendor to manage our bug bounty program. We were pretty small when we started, 500-600 employees, and so didn't have the staff to run our own bug bounty. And they pre-verify a lot of these bugs for us, which helps take the workload of identifying the duplicates and so on off of us. We still see very high value in the program, and I guess we'll talk a little more in detail about that in a little bit.
Alrighty. And then, Lori, you're on the opposite end of the signal to noise spectrum because you've got under 20% invalid and under 30% duplicate, so that implies you have a very high valid rate. Tell me a little bit about the value to Silent Circle in that.
So when you're starting a startup, you're running a pretty lean operation, and you may not have the resources to do internal security teams, large internal security teams. So we kind of value our bounty programs as sort of an augmented security team. So the value might not be necessarily in how many positives we're getting or the type of noise that we might be getting. Obviously, we have some managed programs that do a lot of the frontline communications for us and do all the dedupe administrative work. So we're really focused just on fixing those issues. It's helpful because you can start and stop your program and redefine your scope at will. So when you're first starting out, it's probably the best thing for you to start small, do a short-term test phase, and then figure out where you need to go from there. So,
all right. Well, now that we've kind of gotten their bona fides and why they have experience managing bounty programs out of the way, we took a bunch of questions via Twitter prior to the presentation today over the last few weeks. And today we're going to cover things from best practices, lessons learned, program structure and scoping, researcher engagement, and disclosure policies, lots of other things too. We're going to be a little conversational about it, so hopefully we'll get through everything. So I'm going to start off with you, Charles. What do you wish you'd known before you launched the bounty program?
So when we launched our program, we were very small, and we were a little nervous about how much impact it would have. You launch a program, you don't have a security team really at that point to speak of. We had one person, and just weren't sure how many valid bugs we were going to get and how that was going to interrupt our ability to grow the business that we were trying to grow. And so we had very little idea of what it would take to run the program. We launched with a points-only system to kind of get an idea of what the intake rate would be and then how quickly we could respond. And within a month, actually started paying rewards on that. I think we still, even with that, we underestimated how much time we would spend in resources to verify and understand the bug. So you get a bug in, it's been verified, it's true, but then you have to go reproduce that in a way, or we felt that our security team needed to reproduce that bug in a way that we could sit with the developer and show the developer how it's being exploited and help them determine how to fix it and then verify that. So essentially acting a lot like a QA team. And we just underestimated how much time that would take. And so I think starting over, we'd staff up a little bit earlier than we did.
Alrighty. And Angelo? Mm-hmm. What would you wish you had known?
Yeah. So one of the things we didn't really understand early on was how to forecast and plan both from a resourcing standpoint and from a budget standpoint. So as anyone here that manages a line of budget understands, you have to do a plan for at least 4 quarters out for the whole fiscal year, and it is very challenging to do a plan when it comes to bug bounty. You don't, you don't know how many vulnerabilities you're going to be receiving down the pipeline. So one of the things that helps with that is starting with a private program and ramping up the researchers maybe 10, 20 at a time, because you're going to underestimate the level of engagement for a new private program. And it's not only a financial problem, it's also a resourcing problem, right? And what I mean by that is you don't really have the good understanding of how many man hours or how many dedicated resources it's going to take you to triage those results, make sure you can work with the product teams, get the right level of prioritization, risk analysis, and actually drive them to resolution as well.
All right. Lori?
So one of the biggest challenges for me when I first started managing our bounty programs was understanding the value of a vulnerability and putting a price on that. My initial thought was that the dollar amount, the payout for the bounty was the most important thing to the researcher community. And understanding the differences between dollar value and reputation value. So even if it's 3 or 4 minor, moderate priority bugs that are sitting out there, the value to the researcher might be higher than just the payout, and giving them that recognition and having that kind of communication with them is really important.
All right. So let's go into best practices. We've talked about what we wish we've known. Now that you've run a program for a while, what is sort of your elevator pitch to, you're going to run a bounty? Let me tell you, here's something that I highly recommend doing. And let's start with Lori.
Well, I'm going to harp all day about researcher community outreach. I think it's super important to go out and talk to the community and find out what motivates them, find out what their concerns are, and just that really builds your reputation as well. Make sure that you're always in communication. Sometimes we have some, slip because we're trying to tackle technical debt, and sometimes researchers will get disengaged because you aren't reaching out and communicating about their bounties.
All right. Charles?
I think what we noticed immediately was that the researchers, this is not a business that you're talking with, it's an individual, and in many cases their communication skills are the communication's hampered by the fact that English is probably not the first language. So having somebody in place who has really good customer service skills to be able to communicate with that external person and really bring it to a human level, so not acting like a corporation. The communication should not be filtered by a legal department. It should be a human-to-human communication. You found something, that's great. Let's talk about the details, because very often you get submissions that may not have all the information you need to understand how to reproduce. And so as you have that communication, treat it like a human-to-human communication, just like it's somebody on your team. They're there to help you, and you're paying them for that service. And so treating them like that, I think, is very helpful. Also, recognizing when it's time to increase your bounties. When you first launch, there's a lot of excitement. You get lots of great submissions. We track that over time, and you'll see over time the submission quality goes down a little bit. That's a time to look at increasing the bug bounties or maybe making a change to the program. And so working with external vendors or other folks that are running bug bounties to get ideas about what programs they've run is always a great idea to increase the quality of the submissions, because you really want those high value submissions.
All right, so from my perspective, when you're convincing your organization of opening up a bug bounty program, one of the key things you need to have is a very mature OPSEC practice, right? You need to have a very mature set of individuals that are able to understand risk, impact, and reproduce any vulnerabilities that come your way, because without that, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you don't have very strong application security engineers, that your program is not going to be successful. A couple more notes on that front. Building a relationship with researchers and ensuring you have the right investment on them as far as communication, recognition, swag. That we have a public page where we recognize researchers. It's linked out of our main homepage. That is something that goes very far for them, because they want that level of recognition. They want to put it in their resume, their CV, their LinkedIn page. And last but not least, when you're opening new programs, let's say you acquire a company or you deliver a new product line, there's a couple ways you can go about that. You can add it to the existing scope, or you could, and this is my recommendation personally, you could create a new fork of your program, and you can call it a VIP private program, where you only invite your top 10, top 20 contributors. And so that has been extremely successful for us, because it is a mechanism to recognize them, give them less competition for 1 or 2 months, where they can successfully test that new surface area. And quite frankly, they are going to be much more engaged, because they know they don't have as much competition, and they really become loyal to your platform. Because make no mistake, you are competing for the best talent out there, and you really want to have the top 10% researchers in your program. And so you need to find strategies to win them over. You cannot assume that just because you're offering bounties, they will come, because everyone else is doing the same.
Well, that leads into the next question beautifully, which is, how do you compete for that talent? Because bug bounties are becoming more and more and more popular. When the researcher sits down, how do you make sure they want to work on your program versus someone else's? Charles?
It's a marketplace, so you've got a bounty amount, and so the payouts need to be rational for the work that's happening. For us, we are very wide. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that if we make a change, we pay. I think that's important. You establish a reputation, and I've heard stories of older bug bounty programs. In fact, one just this morning from one of the other speakers, that they worked on found a great bug, submitted it to the company, and there was some fine print about why they didn't get paid. I think being very clear in your bounty program about what you will pay and why, and communicating with someone when they do submit, and thanking them for the help and the attention, have been ways of keeping those testers engaged for us.
Lori, did you want to add anything?
So yeah, definitely set the expectations for your bounty program early. Again, you want to make sure that you are starting out small. If you're just starting a bounty program, just to kind of test the waters a little bit. But as far as competition goes, especially when you're working with a smaller budget, you've got to get creative. We did some fun things where even if the bounty payout was fairly low, we would go back to our vendors and ask, hey, can we either tweet something about this, or can we send them a couple more kudos points for this, because we found it pretty interesting, but based on our vulnerability rating taxonomy, it was a pretty low priority, and we feel like the monetary value just wasn't there. But we want to give them recognition. So you've got to get a little bit creative.
Well, we've been covering a lot of things about researcher engagement, and we're going to come back to working with researchers in a little bit, but I want to also make sure we have time to talk about other aspects of running a bug bounty program. So I'd like to know, how has your bounty program complemented your other security programs? Angelo touched on this a little bit about the importance of having a strong security team. So, the bug bounty didn't replace your security team. So Angelo, do you want to expand a little more on that, or talk about other things that the bounty has done to complement the overall security program?
Absolutely. So the bug bounty program does not replace your security team. It augments it. You may be in a situation where your security team is 5 people as a small company, right? And suddenly you can add 20, 30, 40, 100 more people to your program. So if you're not a large company, it is difficult to absorb. Obviously, it was easier for us, but one of the best things you can do with the valid findings that you get out of a program is try to cluster those by categories and inform the business and your CISO and your product stakeholders. What are the areas where we've seen the most technical debt? And then you can actually use static code analysis tools and dynamic code analysis tools to invest and point them to those areas where you may not have as much visibility. Traditionally, you might not have think that was an area of concern, but now it happens to be because it's not an active area of investment, but you're getting a lot of submissions in that area, right? So you can inform static and dynamic analysis tools based on your findings from your bug bounty, which then helps you build mitigations, controls, monitoring, and it really helps you long term to avoid those issues in the first place.
All right. Lori?
So, as Angelo was pointing out, it really augments your security team. I want to talk a little bit on the business and sales side of things, especially for Silent Circle. Our product is anchored in security, so when we can walk into a customer meeting and have that data point that we have a global network of security researchers who are actively testing and helping us to fortify our product, it's really, nice toggle point.
Yep.
Charles?
We've noticed that it allows our security team to force multiply. You'll see a lot of really new and unique ways of getting into your system and escalating privilege and things like that. And what we've been able to do is when a researcher finds that, we'll create signatures and tools that we've written internally to go search the code and find other places that exists. So it force multiplies. We'll see on average 30x in code in the things that we can get at, even on internal systems, what we've seen externally. So really you get a chance to find new and interesting things across your code base. The new and unique approaches are also useful for training for your internal OPSEC team. So it's just a new way of doing things. We had one researcher that was downloading our zone file and was catching new applications going live before I knew that they were live, literally within minutes, and submitting bugs against them because they had the obvious problems that new apps sometimes have. And so that kind of exposure to new ideas has been great training, and ultimately has led to us building our own tools so that we can do that and catch that before the researchers can. So keeping them on point.
Alrighty. Well, and something that all of you have talked about are public programs and private programs. And some of you started private and then went public. Some of you start some private forks. Lori, starting with you, can you talk a little bit about the decisions between when something's going to be private and when something's going to be public, and that structure?
Sure. So typically when we have perhaps an acquisition or a new program that's coming out, we'll try to start that as a private bounty program with very focused researcher talent. and then run that for a short period of time and see how we do, and then we'll open it up to the public. We've done public and private bounty programs. We've done managed and unmanaged programs. From my own perspective, I would definitely say go with the managed option if you have a smaller team. But when you are talking about something that's new to the market, something that may not have a lot of skill sets out there for the researchers to look at, rely on your third-party vendors to seek out those talents and then start a private program first.
Okay. Charles? Do you want to add anything about program structuring and scoping? So, for example, you have a pretty wide open scope. Are there any things that are deemed out of scope versus not rewardable? So I kind of had an open-ended structure question, and it can apply to private versus public or in scope versus out of scope. Is there a difference for you with a wide open scope between in scope, maybe out of scope, we're going to get in trouble if you test this, and just not rewardable? Do you have any of those differentiations?
We do have a few. So one of the things you have to think about is you may CNAME services, so you might use a Salesforce, for example. And in our case, it might be something like Indeed.Salesforce or something like that. You need to make sure that you have agreements with your vendors if you're going to unleash your testers on their systems. And in that particular case, that isn't one that we would reward on. You'd have to go to Salesforce if you found a bug in Salesforce, unless that was something specifically with the way we implemented something like a domain takeover or something like that. So we have run into a couple of cases where our testers have inadvertently ended up in a third party that we didn't have an agreement with. So you would definitely want to have an agreement with, so you can have a nice conversation with your subs about fixing bugs that they find. But generally, we're fairly wide open, and I don't know how, we haven't done much in the way of acquisition, so I'm not exactly sure how we'd handle that. But my feeling and the way I sold the bug bounty internally was it's already public. If it's a public website, like it's already public. Like there's already people testing it. The only difference is they don't have a way to monetize it through you. So if they find something, they might monetize that some other way that you wouldn't want them to. So if it's public, and we reward on it because we want to know about it.
Yeah. So in our case, we've actually had the opposite situation that Charles mentioned happen, where one of our vendors had a bug bounty program. I'm sorry, not one of our vendors. One of our customers had a bug bounty program, and they identified a problem. They weren't sure if it was their fault or our fault. It was reported to them. In the moment we told them that we had a bug bounty program, the conversation changed dramatically because they understood that we were on the same page. They had a bug bounty program. We had a bug bounty program. It was just a matter of routing to, and it ended up being their issue, but it was a matter of routing it accordingly. I would say having a private program is more predictable in terms of resourcing and budget. Now, make no mistake, private is not confidential. People will tweet about your program. People will post reports about your program, and you'll have to manage that. And it happens rarely, but you'll have to manage it. There are forums, there are communities, there are events. So when you have 1,000 people in your program, it's not a state secret that you have a program. There are pages that list which programs, and we have a public responsible disclosure policy. So one of the mechanisms that you use to recruit people, right, which is why I think having private is very useful. If you have a responsible disclosure policy, they will report to your incident response team, or you'll meet people at conferences like Black Hat, and they'll come to you and say, hey, I found this potential issue, I would like to report it. And so when you tell them, oh, we actually have this program, give me your account or sign up here, and we will be able to reward you if you share it with you. It's so much easier because oftentimes they're not willing to share. Like we had a gentleman speak at Black Hat yesterday about a new ODE in a very popular language from Microsoft. And of course he worked with Microsoft and all that, but we learned about it months before the rest of the industry knew about it. And we were able to do our own mitigations even before Microsoft had their own, right? So that's very valuable to build that sort of relationship and threat intelligence with the community.
You bring up disclosure program and that you have a disclosure policy. Charles, Laurie, do you allow disclosure? Because researchers We talk about the money reward, but researchers like disclosing vulnerabilities for a wide variety of reasons, which aren't really about shaming vendors. It's about educating other developers on a class of vulnerability and how to avoid it, or helping them, develop those bona fides to be able to get a better job and a better career placement. And yes, sometimes just good old-fashioned bragging rights. But does your program allow disclosure? And what went into that decision?
We do allow disclosure after we fixed, of course. But in practice, very few folks have asked to disclose details. In the cases where they were very reasonable and worked with us. They were, in one case, a person was working on their master's thesis and wanted to talk in detail, and so they worked with us and gave us drafts, and we were able to be very involved in that process. So I think everything our experience has been very positive when a researcher is asked to disclose.
I actually have two anecdotes for that one. Officially, our scope does not allow for public disclosure, but we have made some exceptions in the past for that, simply because it affected our mission critical applications, or it had a wider impact. So we really felt like it was important to get that message out to the public, but we've worked with the researchers to kind of coordinate their press releases with our press releases, so there was no scoop being stepped on there. And it's always been a really positive interaction with the researchers. So I would continue to do that. I would continue to practice that on a case-by-case basis.
One of the questions we received over Twitter through private message was a question about how do you balance triaging the bug bounty, which is a bit of firefighting, you don't know what's coming in when, and more strategic security operations. And why don't we start with the smaller, more resource-constrained team, Lori, and talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so the tactical resources, we rely heavily on our vendor to do the dedupe, the first line communications, and then for us internally, I try to automate as much as I can through their APIs to get those tickets resolved as quickly as possible. Obviously, we're a small team, so there's some strategic shifting that has to go with our core development team. But what we try to do is make sure that we're in communication at all times and at all phases of the review process, and getting that resolved as quickly as possible.
Charles?
What was the question again, sorry?
How do you manage triage, best practices for triage, and balancing that with the other strategic security work that you need your security team doing? You don't know if this week you're going to get 50 submissions or 5. So how do you plan your resources?
When we had one person, it was very difficult to answer this question. I think we're in the same boat as Lori then. But as the team has grown, we've got folks that are dedicated to working with the researchers, and that's their full-time position. And then we basically take turns against the wind, like they'll rotate and spend a month working on that, and then maybe a month working on projects. I think it's a common thing in IT to have this balance between doing interrupt-driven work and doing project work. You kind of can't do both. You have to choose one or the other. And so we've taken the multiplexer time slicing approach to that, and it seems to be working pretty well for us.
All right.
Yeah, so I think it absolutely makes sense for the smaller companies that don't have the capacity to rely on a vendor to do triage. For us, since our program is quite massive, we'd rely on our vendor for payments as well as recruiting researchers and helping us with scope, competitions, and engagement. But we do our own in-house triage, which is a model they support. Now, when it comes to triage, it's a very different skill set from your average OPSEC engineer, but it's a very different skill set from your average incident response engineer, because you need someone that understands incident response, customer service, and really application security. So it's a bit of a unicorn, and then that person needs to work with product teams as well to drive things to resolution. So one of the learnings that we had, that we figured out early on, was that doing a rotation on your product security team is not a good idea. There's lack of accountability if you're on rotation that week for bug bounty. We just don't believe, I personally don't believe in that model. So we have a couple of gentlemen dedicated to this program full-time, and they are able to build a relationship with researchers. They understand the patterns, which then informs the product teams, okay, we're seeing a lot of this, maybe we should be looking at a root cause, right? So I think having dedicated resources, whether from your team or from your vendor, it's crucial.
Alrighty. Well, another one of the questions we received via Twitter, I'm going to go ahead and quote this. How do you handle low-quality bugs and low-quality bug finders? Seems to be the hardest part of the job. I'm going to let you guys volunteer for who wants to go first, because this is a hard question.
You cry a lot. No. Yeah, it's a difficult job because the low-hanging fruit is obviously something that's easier to get in and get out and get paid on. So we have to be very strategic about following up on those low-value targets. Sometimes, though, those low-value targets, when daisy-chained together, even though they're not reported by the same researcher, can have a higher business impact on you. And so you really need to be focused on making sure that you're looking at it from a 30,000-foot view and understanding how these things are going to impact your business and react accordingly.
Well, I'm going to pivot the question slightly from the low-risk submissions to the low-quality.
Low-quality.
Yeah.
So I am a parent, so everything is a teachable moment, and what I try to do in my communications, if there is something that's missing or we're just not understanding what they're trying to get at, I will go back to them and ask them, hey, can you provide for me some screenshots, a picture's worth 1,000 words? Can you maybe give us some more information? And sometimes that will drive them to either rewrite the evaluation or send us a lot more information to let us know, okay, this is actually a valid thing. And sometimes when they're just not, we encourage them, hey, try again.
All right.
So they're in there trying to make money, and often we see with the low quality ones that they're just new to security testing, and so we make an investment in those folks in communication and some pointers and working with them, so that, because actually there's a couple of cases where we've gotten things that we thought were low quality submissions and it was just a communication problem. It turned out it was, once we could get talking with them, it was a high value for us to do that. And then we've seen over time researchers learn, and so they're in there, they're new, you get a low quality submission, you work with them, the quality improves in the submission, and then the value improves. And so we've seen now over the past few years that pattern exists, and so investing in the community and getting those folks to really spend time on your program, be engaged with your program, and deliver high value bugs to you is the point.
So for us, I mean, the number one thing is you need to have respect towards your researcher community, even if they don't necessarily have it towards you. Again, you're in a customer service type of role, and some of your hackers, this is a true story. They rely on your bounties as their primary source of income. If you have disagreement over something being applicable or not, they may not be able to pay rent for that month in Brazil or Russia where they live. It is yeah, that's the reality if you get to know them personally. Now, you're not a charity, so you're in the business of paying for resolving security debt. So you want to make sure they understand what is applicable and what is not. And when they send you a submission that is either low quality or not applicable or is just not an issue, right? Like it's a self-attack, we get that all the time. It's like, hey, I can install malware on my own box and then I'm vulnerable. It's like, well, good for you. Yeah, and so there's two strategies we use. One is, you engage your vendor, either HackerOne or Bugcrowd, and they can act as an impartial judge. Strategy number two, which we prefer, you engage an independent adult, and that independent adult can be someone from your team, third party that they never talked before, or ideally one of your top researchers. So you get one of your top hackers, you invite them to that private report that no one else has access to and say, hey, Franz Rosen, what is your opinion on this? And they'll say, well, this is clearly not an issue. And then at that point, the other person, just kind of walks away and hides in the corner. So, yeah, that's our strategy.
All right. Well, and that brings up an interesting segue into technical risk versus business risk. So self-cross-site scripting, well, yes, you can attack yourself, but why would you do that? And so while it may technically be a vulnerability, there's not a lot of business risk there. Have you found there's significant time and effort involved in differentiating that for the researchers in your bug bounty programs? And I hate that I just asked a close-ended question, but I did, so feel free to elaborate.
So we've spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to get the application teams engaged in fixing certain bugs, and especially with the lower value ones, that conversation can be more difficult. Even sometimes the higher value ones, in that there's just not an understanding of how this could be exploited. So we spend time internally to give examples and do tech talks on what you could do with XSS, installing key loggers and things like that locally, and there's other things you can do that are kind of interesting and exciting to show folks. They're just not understanding that, because these are acronyms that if we in the security community talk about all the time, but if you're not doing this every day, you may not know. The other thing that we do is when a bug gets submitted to our development team, we let them choose the priority. I've spent a lot of time at Indeed talking about security bugs as just bugs, like treat it like a quality bug, assign the priority that you think is appropriate to it, and then we watch. And so we don't, as a security team, say, we think this is a high and needs to be fixed immediately. We submit it to the team, the application team, and we let them choose. And if they choose something as a low priority that we think is a high priority, then we know that's an opportunity for training and some learning on that team. And so we work and develop them over time. And we've actually seen there's a number of cases where they've thought that it's more critical than we would have said it was. So it's kind of interesting to see that development, and ultimately what it's doing, we're achieving getting the security team at Indeed to be not just the people with security titles, but the entire company, and we're really seeing that strategy start to work.
Yeah, so we, the way we think about it is just because something comes through the bug bounty program doesn't make it more important. Now, obviously, if it's known externally and we have reason to believe it could be exploited externally, we have a very robust framework to sort of prioritize that internally. Now, your product team will have disagreements. And so that's why you need someone that's an advocate for both the researcher and the product team, and really has the full picture of what is the right call for our customers and the company, right? One of our commitments in our responsible disclosure policy, I think there's two very important commitments in our public responsible disclosure policy. One is, if you follow the rules and you report to us responsibly, we will not initiate legal actions against you. That was a huge win when we were able to get that language in our homepage. And the other commitment is we will communicate with you. So even if we're not able to fix it overnight, even if we don't think it's a high priority, we will let you know every month where your issue is. And because we only pay when something is resolved, when we make a code change, this goes a long way, having a constant communication. Say, well, we're not there yet. We're looking at higher priority submissions, but over the next 2-3 months, we'll give you an update. So just making sure you have a ongoing channel, that goes a long way.
I don't have much more to add to that. It's and I don't want to be redundant, but as far as judging whether or not it has higher technical risk versus business risk, I'm just a conduit to our security engineers. If I feel like perhaps it has a higher business risk, and they're in disagreement with that, we open up dialogue with the researcher and we kind of come to a consensus.
So one of the things that Angelo just mentioned was that he pays when the bug is resolved. Is that the policy that each of you follow? Do you pay on triage? Do you pay on resolution? At what point in that process do you reward the vulnerability? And do you feel that impacts your researcher engagement or the risk of public disclosure before you have a fix available? Let's start with Charles.
We reward when we have identified that it is a problem and that it is correct. So Basically, when we feel like the researcher's work is done, we haven't had an issue with someone wanting to disclose before we've fixed, but that is a risk.
Okay.
So we definitely have a two-step process. We have our frontline communications, the dedupe, and then the validation through our bounty programs. And then we have an internal discussion about the value of and the impact of the issue. At that point is when we go back in and pay the researchers. It'll sometimes pay out before we've resolved the problem.
All right. Well, again, different ways to do different things. I'm getting the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to jump into another question that came in from Twitter, and then I'm hoping we will sneak in one last question. So a Twitter question, or more of a comment, we used a lot of resources on out-of-scope bugs nevertheless, but out of scope, and it used up man hours. You can't ignore them, and you can't reward them without incentivizing more out-of-scope submissions. So how would you handle that in your program if there's a really fantastic submission, but it's explicitly listed as out of scope on your scope sheet? And that's one of the more painful situations to deal with. This is like grad level bounty management. So I'm going to make Angelo answer this one first.
Yeah, so if you're using a platform where there are many other programs, the number one thing you need to realize is that you're not the only program that they're participating in. So if they submit ineligible reports, you will just close them as informative or duplicate. That actually harms, depending on how you do it, that may harm a little bit the reputation. So it is, is an incentive. You can close it in a way that doesn't harm it. You can tell them, okay, please learn from this, and we've closed it as informative. But if you keep submitting it to us and it's not applicable, we'll close it as not applicable, which harms their reputation. Then they cannot get into other private programs. But for us, the number one effective measure is signal control, which is a setting that our vendor enables for us, where we can say, you have to have submitted to other public programs like Yahoo or Square or Twitter. You have to have submitted valid vulnerabilities before you come to us, because we really don't have the time or the patience to deal with people that are new to the bounty scene. So using signal control lets you put a limit on what level of experience are you willing to accept, and we want people that are moderately experienced at least.
Okay. You've already indicated, Charles, if you change code, you go ahead and reward it. So I infer that you go ahead and pay for those out of scopes?
That's what I was going to say. So we've modified our scope based on things that are found, because if we care about what they submitted and we do some work to try and resolve it, then we feel like they submitted something valid, and so we'll change scope when it makes sense. And then in some cases, where I talked about that before with third parties, it can get tricky. So that's where the contractual language comes in.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sneak us into the last question. And what is the best researcher interaction you've had? Because we asked a lot of questions about dealing with low quality researchers, or if researchers disclose before fixed. But give us a happy story to end the panel. Tell me about your best researcher interaction. Charles?
I've got one. So the best researchers will do these. They're either unique issues or they're multiple moves to checkmate kind of issues that you can tell that a lot of thought process and steps went into it. One of the ones that we reacted to very quickly, we thought it was a great find. A researcher his username is Patrick F. Submitted an XXE XML external entity. If you're not familiar with that, basically you can stick an entity request inside an XML stream that makes a call out to a website or sends a file from the local machine to that website. If you use Indeed, you upload your resume. That's probably in docx format, which is XML, and so we convert that so we can display it on the web. And this researcher found a way to basically make a call to an external service from our internal server. When we saw that, we immediately went and freaked out, looked through all our logs to see if this had ever happened before. He was definitely the first one, but super exciting, interesting, and we treated it as an incident internally. So I thought it was a great find and a great interaction with that researcher, and something that we fixed immediately.
Alrighty. Lori?
I'm sorry.
I'm going to work my way down.
So, yeah, we're allowed to say the researcher's name.
By all means.
Well, their handle. Recently, we had a variety of submissions that were very, very similar. They were all affecting multiple domains. And the Days New was very respectful in communicating with us, and I enjoyed it because he always started his tickets out with, "I hope you're doing well on your side of the screen." That always engages me and sort of, it puts me at ease. I know they're not ready to attack. But we decided that we were going to bundle these together and pay them out appropriately because the effort to find them across multiple domains was actually pretty small. And he was super accepting of that, so it was great.
All right, so they're kicking us out of the stage, but yeah, just briefly, so our best researcher is a 16-year-old from Argentina. So by volume, he has made enough bounties to buy a few houses there. And we were able to fly him over with his family to San Francisco, meet the Salesforce team. He's here today in Vegas and Black Hat, and we're very excited to sort of interact with the new up-and-coming young research community, and hopefully in the future they'll work for us. So.
Yeah, and that's an important point. I know I'm out of time. Your bounty is a recruiting pipeline. Don't forget that. So please tweet at us. We're going to be out in the hall or in the wrap room taking additional questions. Really hope you got something useful out of this. And again, thank you for coming today. And thank you to my panelists. They were fantastic.
Thank you.